Oh, first one that comes to mind, I guess John Coltrane Quartet. The record called John Coltrane Quartet Plays. That record, which is it's the one that has there are two tracks on there that are incredibly influential to me and just like great versions of Coltrane's band playing, which is Chim Chim Cheree and a tune called Brasilia. So just talk now.
Yeah, Chim Chim Cheree's a soprano sax.
Soprano sax, 3/4. You know, it's kind of like followed in the you know the mold that he started with My Favorite Things, but just take it and just take it to its like highest degree. That to me is just a great version of like the epitome of where jazz kind of went in the '60s and where Coltrane's music. I think when Coltrane's music reached its real maturity. Just because it's a modal tune that basically has no boundaries, no harmonic boundaries. So it's in a key. I think it's in D minor or something. But rhythmically and harmonically, the band is just in such incredible sync. To me, it's one of the greatest versions of his soprano playing at that time. And the other tune on that record that I really love is this tune called Brasilia, which he actually recorded. I just got this Village Vanguard box set, and there's a version of Brasilia on there from 1961 or 62, and then they re-recorded it. I think this record was recorded in '65, which is one of my favorite periods of Train. And it's, to me, that tune is one of the breaches, or one of the fusions of when Coltrane was playing music that was in time and swinging and 4/4, and to where he went from that to playing free music, because that tune contains it all. And it starts off free, it goes into a time thing. McCoy Tyner plays a solo in time. Coltrane comes back in playing in time, but somewhere towards the second half of Coltrane's second solo, it's funny because I play that for people. You can hear the time through the whole thing, but Elvin is no longer playing tang tanga tang. They're just superimposing phrases upon phrases, and it builds and builds and builds. It doesn't sound like there's any time there, but if you really listen, there is time there. And then when they come out of it and they come back into the time thing, to me it's one of the greatest things on record. So I mean that record is a real standout for me.
Yeah. You mentioned before that like your dad, you were sick and your dad said, "What do you want?" And the newest John Coltrane record, and he brought home A Love Supreme.
Yeah.
Were your ears ready for that? I mean, when you first heard that, how old were you at that point?
I was 13 or 14. Were my ears ready for it? I had been listening previous to that. I think the only Coltrane record I had was because it was in my earliest days, and I had just heard about this guy named John Coltrane, and my father had brought home because he didn't know anything about jazz, so he worked in Manhattan, and he would stop in a jazz record store and pick up records for me.
What did your dad do?
He was in the textile business in Manhattan. And the first record he got me for Christmas was a record called Settin' the Pace, which was one of the Prestige records, which to me is still one of the greatest records Train ever recorded. Of that period, I think it's the best. It has Little Melanie on it, and Rise and Shine, and I forget what other tunes are on there. I See Your Face Before Me. It's such a great version of Coltrane's progression at that time. Yeah. It's just great, Second record, let's see, what's something I listened to? I've been listening to Bela Bartok, violin concerto.
Is that are you a Bartok fan or that particular piece?
I'm a big Bartok fan, but that to me is one of his one of his greatest works. It's one of his least. It's one of his more out works, but still is very rooted in tonality, much more than some of his violin sonatas and some of the other things that he did. That's a piece that I was introduced to years ago I just bought it by chance because I love violin concertos, and I really am a big fan of classical music. And when I first heard that, just the melodies and the heart and the soul and the spirit that's in that music fascinated me in the beginning. At first, when I first heard it, it really took me a while for my ear to catch kind of what it was about harmonically, because he had a different harmonic system, which I totally don't understand at this point. But that to me is one of my favorite records that I keep going back to and listening, to.
Interesting. Do you ever play any of his music?
I have, I play some of his Microcosmos on piano. Deceptively simple pieces, that, when you look at them, you think, oh yeah, that's what that is. Because I play classical piano a bit at home. I started playing classical piano when I was 6 years old, so I have just a little bit of an ability to be able to play it, and I do actually, at times, sit down and look at, like that violin concerto, for instance. I wrote a tune on one of my records, a record called Enter the Spirit, which I did a few years ago, a tune called Blues for Bela, which I basically lifted a couple of phrases from the violin concerto and used in that, but it's just a minor blues. But yeah, I mean, there are things in Bartok, like I've just been recently checking out how he superimposes one dominant chord on top of another dominant chord. Like he'll take an F dominant chord, an F dominant 7, and then run an F7 into an A7. And it sounds like a really simple thing, but when you put it all together, it sounds amazingly hip, and far out, And a lot of his music sounds like that. A lot of his music is rooted in kind of real traditional tonality, but the way he puts it all together and his harmonic system was such that it just sounds incredibly modern. Number 3, a record by Frank Sinatra called A Swingin' Affair, which I just ordered. It's one of Frank Sinatra's Capitol recordings with arrangements by Nelson Riddle. I think it's the one that has Night and Day on it. It was out of print for a while, and I grew up listening to Sinatra, and actually after I was a teenager and started getting into jazz, totally hated it. I didn't want to hear Sinatra. I thought it was corny. I thought it was, it represented something that I was rejecting at that time. Then when I was playing with Miles, Miles mentioned his name to me. I knew about Sinatra, but Miles mentioned something about his phrasing, and I went out and bought another Sinatra record, which I really like, which is one that he did with Antonio Carlos Jobim, which is a very nice record. And then shortly after that, I was in Sweden visiting my wife. She was living in Sweden at the time. And somebody had reissued all those Capitol records, and I picked up this record, A Swingin' Affair, just by chance. I bought about 5 or 6 Sinatra records. And that one really still stands out to me as to be one of his best records. I'm a big Sinatra fan. I love his singing. I think, to me, like a lot of the time when I want to play a new standard and I want to check out like the original version with the lyrics and all that stuff, I'll listen to Sinatra do it, because I think sometimes his versions are some of the purest versions of those tunes. That's one of my favorite records. I love that record. It's just swinging, the great arrangements. I mean, Nelson Riddle's arrangements were great. They're sparse, they're not gaudy or showy, they're like real slick with, bass clarinets, and they're kind of quiet and subdued, and they let Frank do his thing, Free for all. Yeah, I love that record. The thing I love about that record, first of all, it's got some of my favorite players on it. Freddie's on it, and Wayne's on it. And, those are two of my favorite. I mean, I think in certain ways, Freddie Hubbard, when he was playing at his top of his form, other than Miles, was probably my favorite trumpet player. To me, I could listen to Freddie Hubbard forever. And I loved Lee Morgan, and and there were some other guys I loved at the time, but to me, Freddie had it all. I recently re-listened to that record, because I hadn't listened to it for years, and man, it just killed me, like how live it sounds, and how exciting that record is. That's a fucking exciting record, man. So the Blue Note period, there's so many records that I love from that time, but that record, to me, has a different sound than the other Blue Note records, you know? It's like, it sounds like a live gig, and it was in the studio. So, I mean, you know, to me, yeah, that maybe is a standout for those Blue Note records. Miles Davis record called Cookin', which, I don't know if you know that one. You know, that was from that period when they did Steamin' and Relaxin' and Workin', and the original quintet, I guess the one with stablemates on it. To me, Cookin' always stood out. To me, that, you know, that one was the one where Coltrane really, you know, came into his own in that early period. Also, you know, the record has Philly Joe Jones on it, who to me was the greatest drummer of that time. I mean, you know, in fact, I was recently listening to a record with Philly Joe on it, a Hank Mobley record, and man, this guy was so incredible. I mean, I don't know how drummers feel about Philly Joe Jones. I mean, only the ones I've spoken to who all talk about him like he was the cat, you know, and Paul Chambers. I mean, you know, that band was just so great. And that's another one of those records that has like a live sound to it. So, I mean, that also stands out as being one of my favorite records.